In 1818, Norwegian archaeologists made a truly remarkable discovery that peeled back the curtain on the past, revealing for the first time the true picture of Viking life and death. During these excavations, fragments of unusual tools, exquisite jewelry, and intricately carved wooden artifacts were unearthed. This was a startling revelation that fundamentally changed the prevailing perception of Vikings, from the image of rampaging northern invaders, armed with swords and mythical horned helmets, whose raids swept across European lands. They emerged as a people whose civilization was complex and artistically refined, comparable to any other culture in Europe at the time. Archaeological investigations conducted at numerous burial sites throughout Scandinavia provide an unprecedentedly deep understanding of the life of the Norse Vikings. These graves, arranged like crypts, were filled with items their owners believed were necessary for their journey into the afterlife. For these people, the only effective means of travel was by water, and they developed truly remarkable vessels. When the first excavations began, archaeologists initially found it hard to believe that such elegant ships were actually used for sailing. However, these vessels proved to be astonishingly seaworthy, extremely maneuverable, and, notably, had a draft of only about 3 inches, allowing them to travel up rivers. One of the Vikings' notable customs was burying their prominent individuals in their own ships, equipped with all necessary accoutrements, as they believed that death was merely a transition, a great journey. All items that might be needed for life and eternity were placed on the ship, which was then committed to the earth. Thanks to this practice, many artifacts have been preserved in excellent condition. So, who are these mysterious, yet far from primitive, people with their complex burial rituals, and what propelled them to dominance during the Dark Ages? This story begins in the late 8th century on the high plateaus of Norway. There is some evidence that sheds light on what life was like for these people before the Vikings ventured out to sea and began their famous raids. They were generally a settled, predominantly agricultural society, organized around villages or their clans. They were likely strongly family-oriented, though this is not known with absolute certainty. These small communities were led by chieftains who sometimes engaged in inter-clan warfare. However, Viking life was largely a continuous struggle for survival. The climate in their lands was significantly colder than in the rest of Europe, and the weather could be extremely harsh at times. Survival was likely not easy, and this circumstance is important for understanding their subsequent actions. At the dawn of the Viking Age, the family farm served as the primary economic unit in Norwegian society. As farmers and herders, they grew grains and vegetables during short growing seasons and depended heavily on livestock. However, peace in the northern lands was inexorably coming to an end. The growing Viking population urgently needed more fertile lands, and societal tension was building. Inevitably, violence erupted between Viking clans as stronger groups attacked weaker ones. Raiders descended upon farmers, using axes, swords, and exhibiting extreme violence. Land disputes escalated into complete lawlessness. Essentially, a conung chieftain or king was an influential man who owned extensive land and had his bonds free farmers and slaves under his command. Whenever he decided to attack someone else, he would simply gather all these people and launch an assault. Vikings would storm a village, seize everything they could carry, and depart just as swiftly. Such actions were not particularly sophisticated but were highly effective. Nevertheless, some Vikings, putting aside their internal feuds, prepared to seek their fortunes in other lands. The hands and tools that once served to build barns were now turned to an entirely different task. Along the shores of the northern fjords, ships began to be built, vessels that changed the lives of these people, the legendary Viking longships. These extraordinary ships, revolutionary in their design, steered history onto a new course and initiated an offensive that dominated Europe and beyond for the next 3 centuries. In the longship, Vikings embodied generations of shipbuilding and seafaring skills. There would be no Vikings without the Viking ship, and it was this evolution of technology that allowed them to leave such an indelible mark on history. Over time, they learned to build boats seaworthy enough for sailing the North Atlantic. This gave the Vikings their unprecedented long-range capability. One of these boats could be assembled in a month or 6 weeks, and the design was always absolutely identical. They built a boat either as wide as needed for calm waters or as deep as needed for the open ocean. And if they needed a boat for navigating the rivers of Russia or Europe, a raiding vessel that could penetrate deep into the continent's heart, they could use the same style, the same construction technique, but simply in a scaled-down version. They were light enough to be carried over portages, dragged up rivers, and could be sailed. This was one of their important features because the boats were lightning fast and nothing could catch them. These were no longer coastal vessels, like many Mediterranean ones. They undertook voyages from Norway to Scotland, from the Faroe Islands to Iceland, and from Iceland to Greenland across open waters that were too dangerous for coastal ships. And the Vikings were not afraid of this. They had the technology to do it. The result was a shallow draft, highly adaptable boat, a technological marvel for its time. No single king or central government governed these people. Each Scandinavian village operated independently, each proclaiming its own king. The Vikings united in this audacious mission, leaving women and children behind and venturing out to sea. They sought plunder, and thus armed themselves accordingly. Among the first victims of their raids were the monks of Lindisfarne, home to St. Cuthbert's Monastery, in June 793 AD. Lindisfarne was one of the holiest sites in the British Isles, rich in piety and more tangible treasures. The monks would ring bells, go to mass, and then these dragons would appear from the sea. The Vikings descended upon them like a storm, slaughtering them, carrying off everything, and burning the place. The monks faced a living hell, often describing it as if devils from the underworld had been unleashed upon them. The Vikings were warriors, there is no doubt about that. They lived by instilling fear, using intimidation and terror. They were raiders, they were soldiers. I believe they were extremely fierce, incredibly greedy, and exceptionally skilled. That is, we consider these people barbarians, but in reality, I think their battle order, the way they moved towards a target in a very disciplined military fashion, all suggests otherwise. A Viking warrior was a very simple fighting machine. He was a large, muscular Norseman, often clad in leather armor. Each was armed with very simple tools, a knife, a sword, and a battle axe. And, reportedly, it was the battle axe that was the most formidable of these weapons, because Vikings possessed immense skill in throwing these axes to, well, sever people's heads or incapacitate them. Monasteries along the coast particularly attracted Vikings due to their large concentrations of wealth and the passivity of the monks. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, begun in the late 800s, is a primary source for English history from the 5th to the 11th century. It records the horror caused by Viking invasions. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne by plunder and slaughter. This attack on the monks and their treasures in 793 AD became a historical landmark, the first major Viking raid. But Lindisfarne and other vulnerable monasteries along the coast of the British Isles were just the beginning. As the end of the 8th century approached, Viking raiders set their sights on bigger prizes. Europe's major cities were soon to feel the might and fury of these Norsemen and their steel. The Vikings left Scandinavia for plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne in 793 AD ignited a hell of Viking barbarism that threatened to engulf all of Europe. By the mid-9th century, just 50 years after Lindisfarne, rumors of Europe's immense wealth spread northward. Families, villages, and entire communities banded together to build longships. They planned to improve their fortunes at the expense of those living across the sea. Just as the Spanish later sought gold when they came to America, the Vikings sought silver. Silver was of great value to them, and many religious items, crosses, and various objects found in monasteries were made of silver. Viking factions set off across the sea, without a single ruler to unite them. Even as their fleets grew to dozens of ships, each operated independently, making their attacks even harder to stop. The reputations of individual Viking chieftains began to grow, as did their ambitions. Europe was their prey. Europe is an unusual continent because it is crisscrossed with rivers, all of which are navigable, unlike North America or Africa, which have only a few very large rivers. Europe has many, so Vikings could launch their vessels on almost any major waterway. Remember, they were narrow and long, and didn't need much water. One of the first major river assaults occurred in 845 AD, led by the infamous Viking chieftain Ragnar. With a fleet of 120 ships, he descended upon Paris, using the same approach as in Lindisfarne. Before reaching the city, Ragnar's Vikings annihilated the French vanguard on the banks of the Seine, sending their French captives to a horrific end. Essentially, they were terrorists and relied heavily on terror to ease their way. You know, they didn't want to do more work than necessary, so they tried to be as horrifying as possible. There was one famous Viking who was sarcastically called the child lover, because he was said to toss infants into the air and impale them on his sword as they fell. So, these were not very pleasant people. A local monk, Ermentarius, described the Viking invasion and the destruction that continued for decades along the Seine and other rivers. The number of ships grows, the endless stream of Vikings constantly increases. Everywhere Christians are victims of massacres, arsons, plunder. The Vikings sweep everything in their path, and nothing can stand against them. When a large Viking fleet sailed down the Seine and approached Paris, this enormous, well-defended city, the King of France, who was in Paris, instead of confronting them head-on and risking possible destruction, decided to buy them off. King Charles the Bald of France paid Ragnar nearly 6 tons of silver and gold to make the raiders leave and never return. This had the opposite effect, as rumors of such spoils spread, of lands and goods everywhere. The plundering of northern Europe only intensified. Between 790 and 1100 AD, Vikings followed every major river and waterway deep into the continent. But a new world awaited the Vikings. The Norwegians wrote, arguably, the most vibrant chapter in Viking history. As fearless explorers, they colonized Iceland and Greenland. They pushed further west. With this colonization came the story of 2 legendary Norwegian Vikings, Eric the Red and his son, Leif Erikson. In the late 900s, Eric was the first to settle this harsh land. A hot-tempered man, Eric was soon exiled from Iceland for 3 years. He sailed west and settled on the east coast of Greenland. And he began to advertise this land. He couldn't say, by the way, we only have a small stretch of coast that's habitable at all. So he said, we have Greenland. It's covered in green. Some undoubtedly came, saw what it truly was, and returned home. But many very strong, resilient, and hardy Vikings remained, and their lives were very severe. The land was not very suitable for plowing, but fishing and other meat were available. But it was a harsh land. During Eric the Red's rule, the Scandinavian society struggled to survive in this distant land. For governance, villages gathered at the Althing, a type of popular assembly or court, transplanted from their homeland. Here, free people had the right to speak in their own defense and on matters concerning the community. From this community of free people emerged Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Like his father, he was driven by exploration. In 1000 AD, he set sail. Leif Erikson followed a rumor. Another Viking before him had left a record of traveling west, trying to reach another colony in Greenland, but he was blown off course, and by the time he found his bearings, he found himself off the coast of a very green and lush land. Well, Greenland was neither green nor lush. This is a fascinating, but still very controversial matter. I personally believe that America was discovered by the Vikings around 1000 AD. For example, Leif Erikson's village in Newfoundland has been carbon dated precisely to 1000 AD. Thus, we know that Vikings were at least in Newfoundland, and likely further south. The colonization attempt in Newfoundland, however, was unsuccessful. The colony in Newfoundland lasted only a decade. But 500 years before Columbus made his epic voyage, the Vikings connected the eastern and western hemispheres. After wintering in Newfoundland, Leif Erikson returned to Greenland and brought something new to the island's settlers. With the same tools used to build longships, they erected crude crosses of a new religion. They decided to embrace Christianity. Leif Erikson had traveled to Norway, where the king specifically asked him to bring Christianity to Greenland and Christianize their colonies, which he diligently did. As Viking influence spread, the outside world, in turn, shaped Viking culture. Chiefs viewed Christianity as a tool to unite clans and, ultimately, to gain greater control over them. In the early 11th century, 200 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, the Norse people still lacked a single king and felt little solidarity. Christianity presented a unifying cause. However, Christian Vikings faced resistance from their pagan kinsmen, who were unwilling to abandon their ancient gods. Kings began to embrace Christianity because it served their interests. It helped them consolidate power, and they started to impose it on the populace. There was significant conflict. People disliked it and resisted giving up their old customs, fearing what might happen. Some Christian missionaries came to the island and converted a few, but many remained skeptical. One day, they decided to conduct a test. The challenge pitted them against the pagan deities and their representatives, including a renowned berserker, a man, to put it mildly, quite unhinged. These Christian missionaries issued a challenge: we will light a fire, and you pagans, light a fire. If the berserker can walk through your fire but cannot walk through ours, then we will know that Christianity has triumphed. But if he cannot walk through yours, then we will know that paganism has won. It was reminiscent of an Old Testament duel. Sources indicate the Viking berserker easily walked through the fire lit by the pagans but could not pass through the fire lit by the Christians. Thus, all present witnessed that Christianity was the true religion. In Norway, the great catalyst for Viking unity emerged in the fate of one young boy. Harald Hardrada was the half-brother and heir of the Norwegian King Olaf. He was only 15 years old when he fought on the losing side of a Viking civil war. But Harald returned to seek revenge, writing his history with the blood of his enemies. Vikings spread across Europe like a deadly plague. Initially, their targets were unarmed monasteries, but soon the invaders sowed terror deeper into the continent. Eventually, Vikings turned against each other. Norway was gripped by civil war. In 1030, at the Battle of Stiklestad, forces loyal to the then Danish ruler Knut the Great fought against the Norwegian King Olaf. From the ashes of internecine strife rose a young warrior, Harald Hardrada, King Olaf's half-brother and heir. By the mid-11th century, as Harald matured, he harbored the ambition to lead and unite Norway. But first, he needed to gain the power to do so. Harald was an interesting character. His Viking career, if one can call it that, began when he was still young. At 16, he was wounded in a battle that ultimately claimed his royal brother's life, and he fled. Harald Hardrada faced exile in distant northern lands. He headed to Sweden, and then to Kiev, a prosperous trading city in modern-day Ukraine. In 1031, he followed the route along which Swedish Vikings had, for the previous 2 centuries, established trading centers to access exotic eastern goods. The Swedes came as brutal raiders but stayed to become merchants. Through trade, Kiev connected the northern world with the broader world of the east. When hordes of coins from this period are found, they are from all over the world, as are various artifacts like Buddha figurines and other antiquities. These finds demonstrate the extensive connections these people had. They were far more significant for these connections than for simple plunder. Harald understood that without a market for his spoils, his power was limited. Vikings had lived by trade for hundreds of years. When you go and sack a monastery, grabbing a bunch of chalices and manuscripts, you wouldn't take that home. What good is it? You had to go somewhere and exchange it for what you truly needed. However, material goods constituted only part of the trade. Vikings also engaged in human trafficking, acting as slave traders. They sold men and women captured during their raids. Women in those days died at a horrifying rate during childbirth, necessitating a constant replenishment of women. They captured girls, took them away, undoubtedly raped them, and then delivered them to slave pens to be sold. Despite these harsh economic lessons, Harald came here not only to seek his fortune in the market. He also had to embrace the role of a